There you go. Some of the reasons to vote yes, according to Trent Zimmerman. Meanwhile, 1 million driverless cars will be on Australian roads by 2035, and people could access the vehicles under a subscription service. This is according to a report from motoring body NRMA. The 6-month study into Australia's driverless future says car ownership would drop substantially as people would lease vehicles on a subscription basis. And driver's licences, well, they would become redundant as well. Joining me live now is Urban Infrastructure Minister Paul Fletcher for a bit more on this. Thanks for your time today, Minister.
Pleasure.
Beneficiaries are spoken about as the young, the elderly, the disabled, I guess pub goers as well, I might put out there. But what about the future of anyone driving a vehicle as a job? Because it's a huge employer, isn't it?
Oh, clearly one of the issues here is employment implications, but I suppose the point I'd make is there's a lot of divergent projections about what driverless vehicles will mean, as well as when they're going to arrive. It's pretty certain they're going to arrive, but whether they're the majority of vehicles on the road by any given point, there are quite divergent views, and then what the implications are. So some people say it'll mean more capacity on our roads because the curbside lanes that are today used for parking will become available to drive in. On some estimates, about 30% of vehicles in the CBD are circling looking for a park, so that's all pressure you take off the system. But other people make the point, and the NRMA report makes this point as well, that typically cars today are used only a very small percentage of the time, maybe 1 hour a day. Rest of the time they're sitting in a garage or parked somewhere. What is very likely is that when driverless cars become common, they will be used more intensely, many hours a day, and it certainly will mean that people who today aren't able to use a car will be able to, or a vehicle will be able to drive around. Children going to school, but also things like, will people be sending a driverless car to the dry cleaner to pick up their dry cleaning? So there could be uses for vehicles which which are not feasible.
Absolutely,
today.
a lot of benefits you mentioned there. But what do you say to someone driving a cab right now? Look, be careful of your future.
Look, I think I'd say a few things. First of all, there are different projections as to the rate at which this occurs. I think I'd say that the NRMA report has quite a strong view as to how quickly we'll see a take-up of driverless vehicles. So the first thing that has to happen is that we need to get vehicles that are up what the Society of Automotive Engineers calls level 5. So level 0 is no assistance whatsoever. Level 1 is things like cruise control, which is pretty common today. There are already vehicles on the road which have pretty sophisticated lane assist, lane keeping, or reverse parking, so you just press the button.
Yeah, all that stuff there. But I guess
my point is that you need to get up to really level 5, which is the vehicle is capable of being controlled the whole time, and there's no need for the driver ever to resume control. In fact, as the NRMA report points out, you don't even have a driver.
Which would take a while. I guess the point I'm asking, though, do you need some government level to think about what is a huge employer for all sorts of transport, and have something in mind? Is that something you've turned your mind to?
Look, there's a whole range of implications for government. So the Transport and Infrastructure Council, which is the state and federal transport ministers, are overseeing a piece of work being done by the National Transport Commission, the NTC, which is stepping out an agenda here. So things like the laws to do with insurance, how do those need to change? But there's also a very important issue for Australia is how do we make sure we're on the production side of this industry as well as just the consumption side, and there are some real points of light here. It's a company called Coda Wireless in South Australia who produce components that are being used in a number of early stage driverless vehicles, and there's a number of other centres of expertise in Australia. So
even though we don't make cars anymore.
Well, but here's the point, that the economics of making big boxes of metal may not be something that Australia can succeed at, but providing software is very different, and if we've got the expertise there may well be opportunities for us as a nation. So Arthur Sinodinos, as Minister for Industry and Innovation, within his portfolio there's certainly some work going on there, including some money into a cooperative research centre on this topic.
See where that goes. I want to look into a few things in the budget on infrastructure. The funding model for the Western Sydney Airport says that it basically needs to make a profit now. Wouldn't it make a profit earlier with a rail link that's been pushed out?
So there are, as you rightly say, in the budget we committed $5.3 billion of equity to a government-owned company that will build and own the airport. And just this week, the company was incorporated. 4 directors announced. The chair will be Paul O'Sullivan, who's the chair of Optus, former chief executive. He's on a number of other boards, and we've got 3 other directors with serious corporate experience, including serious airport and aviation experience. Now, on the question of rail, there is a lot of work underway between the New South Wales and the Commonwealth governments. There's a joint scoping study underway, which is looking at what would the right route be, how much would it cost, how should that be funded, and when should it be built?
So it could be earlier than projected at the moment?
Well, that report, that scoping study will report to the 2 governments reasonably soon, and we'll have more to say about that.
And more broadly on this equity approach that you're taking to infrastructure, is it going to mean more tolls and fewer rail links? Because you don't make money from a rail link, do you? You make money from a toll road.
Well, if you look at where we are using an equity approach, for example, Western Sydney Airport, and airports, as we know from the privately owned and operated Sydney Airport, Brisbane Airport, in fact all of Australia's major airports, these are very viable private businesses. If you look at, for example, the Moorebank Intermodal Terminal, where the Commonwealth is putting in equity, again, these are businesses with a significant revenue stream, proven business models. Australian Rail Track Corporation charges fees to train operators to use the rail. Of course, there's an $8.4 million injection of equity into ARTC for inland rail in this budget. So,
but the urban rail might be the issue, and just further to that point on the equity model, because if you look at infrastructure spending, $7.6 billion to $8 billion to 6 to 5 to 4.2. It's a big drop. No,
let's be clear. Infrastructure spending is going up. There's a record amount being spent this year. The Shadow Minister likes to use misleading figures which just assume away $5.3 billion of equity committed to Western Sydney Airport, $8.4 billion of equity committed to ARTC.
But that's because it's not a spend. In terms
it
of
is
what comes out of
it. Let's be clear. This is dollars.
It's money, but you're
this is dollars going into the economy to build infrastructure assets. So when you look at what is the Commonwealth government, what is the Turnbull government spending on infrastructure, we're spending at record amounts. We are spending very substantial amounts of grant funding going to state governments for a whole range of projects. West Connects, Tullamarine Freeway, second range crossing into Toowoomba, all around Australia. The $2.3 billion package we announced with the West Australian
We're nearly out of time, but just to go to that point again, because won't it mean urban rail, by definition, won't miss that, urban rail doesn't make money, does it?
Look, there's always going to need to be grant funding as a component of funding urban rail. That's why we announced that we will spend $10 billion over the next 10 years on urban rail, or on within our big cities and surrounding regional areas. So that was a major commitment in this budget. There's always going to be a mix of grant funding and other forms of funding like equity and loans. We're determined to use all means of funding and financing because we've got a big infrastructure challenge, and if we get it right, then the benefits in terms of productivity and livability in our cities and around the country are enormous.
All right, it's a big and complicated area, so I'm sure we'll chat again down the track. Thank you, Paul Fletcher, for that.
Thanks for your time.
Well, more now on Cassandra Sainsbury, of